Thank you so much. Again, thank you for inviting me here. I'm excited to be presenting here, and happy birthday, Doug. Really appreciate it. First and foremost, I'm an engineer, so I'm a little bit out of my element. That also means there will be theorems and definitions in the presentation, but I'll be skipping over most of them. So, but in any case, the video will be available, and if you have any questions, you can study them and send me emails later. All right. So my talk is about the 3 times my research overlapped with Doug's. The first is a collaboration that we had in like mid 2000s, 2005, 6, in that time frame. And it was on a random number generator design. It was a hardware random number generator design. And why do we need hardware random numbers? Well, for many things in cryptography and security, you basically need them for nonces, salts, session keys, randomized encryption schemes, signatures, authentication codes, pretty much everything, and also not the least for randomization against side channel security. In hardware, in software implementations are also being randomized now to prevent such attacks. Traditionally, such devices have been built using very simple analog electronics processing techniques. So I'm talking about 99, in that time frame, late 90s, early 2000. This is an example of random number generator design diagram, really high level, put together by Intel and analyzed by cryptography research at that time. So basically, you have an electronic device such as a resistance, and it has a noise term on it, although it's supposed to be precise with a specific, for a voltage, supposed to pass a certain current, but that doesn't happen. There's variation on it. And we pick that up, post-process it, amplify it, and so on, lots of electronic processing. And then in the end of the day, we're still not sure about it. And what we do is we basically, apply something like von Neumann correction and, out of desperation, apply a cryptographic hash. And we said at the time, okay, there must be something better we can do. And at the time, we're also talking to General Dynamics. And by we, I mean Bill Martin and myself. We're advising senior thesis. And they said, why don't we look at a random number generator design together? And as a folkloric piece of information, they said, jitter could be used in circuits for building random number generators. And ideally, we want to be able to get a high rate, such as up to 1 gigabit per second if possible. And we said, okay, we started looking into it. And basically, what is jitter? So very quick pseudo animation, if you will. If you take an odd number of inverters, these are logic gates, right? Inverter gates, and combine them. Maybe let's say 3 is the least you can start, or maybe even 1 you can start out with, and take the output, feed it back into its input. You will get alternating flips, right? 0 to 1, 1 to 0, and so on. And if you measure the voltage across and display it on an oscilloscope, this is how it's going to look like over time. But what happens is this thing, sorry, went too fast. Yeah, Bill warned me against it. So this is the kind of movement you will see. It will move around, although the edges are meant to be at precise locations, because there is variation on the delay of these gates. What's going to end up is that the edge is going to move around. If you plot this out, this is the kind of variation you will see. Not surprisingly, like in many physical things, we see a Gaussian distribution of the edge's precise location centered around the ideal location. And the standard deviation is tiny. It's small, really. So you see tiny variations if you overlap these signals. And this is the zone where we have essentially a non-deterministic signal, right? It's varying, and if we're able to sample from that, we might be able to get random bits. So that's the idea behind this random number generator. On an oscilloscope, this is how it looks like if you overlap them. And this is our own recording of an implementation using 57 inverters. The number of inverters just basically affects the period of the signal, right? And you see, this is real world. It doesn't look ideal like the nice square waves and so on. But these edges, they move around. And again, if you look at the distribution, it's Gaussian. And So where does jitter come from? Many things such as crosstalk, power source variability, variability in the devices. It's embedded. There are so many different effects, including quantum effects. So in a way, you can say we don't know what that is. We use that as our randomness source. And now we want to sample this. And every time we sample, if it's about a half, we can round it up to 1. If we sample it, if it's less than half of the swing, right, voltage swing, we can decode it as a 0. And hopefully that's a random bit. The problem is this variation is a tiny fraction of the period. It's about 3 to 5%. And if we sample anywhere else, we essentially get a deterministic bit. So at that point, we bring in a model. We brought in a model, a discretized model. We said, okay, let's assume the period is split into urns, these little intervals, maybe 3 to 5%, right? If it's, let's say, 5%, you will have 20 urns. And you want to be able to sample from an urn, right? And what we can do is we can bring in multiple rings and take their outputs and combine them, right? And the question is, how many rings do we need to fill out the entire spectrum? And that leads us to the coupon collector problem, well-known, well-studied. And if we have n urns, right, if it's 5%, for example, then you need 20. We have 20 urns, so 20 times log n, log 20. That's how many urns do we need to have a pretty decent confidence that most of the urns are filled. And when we sample, we'll truly get a random bit. The problem is, in practice, this needs a lot of rings. It's massive, it's big, and not ideal. So this is where Doug comes in. Doug was visiting us at the time. And we were thinking about using something like a fuzzy extractor and so on to process this signal. He said, what you really need is a resilient function. Because you will sample, when you sample, sometimes you'll hit the urn, you get a random bit, but many times you'll sample deterministic bits. Excuse me. If you XOR them together, you can narrow it down, but if you actually apply a resilient function with a certain rate, you can eliminate with high confidence the deterministic bits, just hash it down using a resilient function, and you get essentially a random output with high confidence. And this worked out really well. And this is a resilient function construction. You can just get it from a linear code, fairly easy, well studied. And finally, we wrote our paper. This was in 2007, if I remember correctly. Yeah, when it appeared. Yes, 2007. And many years passed since then. We had some early harsh criticism from some competing groups from Siemens. Not about the model or the math, but it was more about the, can you sample that fast and so on, these physical aspects. But we also had tons of positive feedback from practitioners and people who actually used our random numbers generator design. And then after 2010, I stopped, working on random number generators, moved on. And it turns out mid 2013, 14 maybe, I came across somebody from Broadcom, a former manager, who said we actually, implemented your random number generator and included into a chip, a communications chip that went into the iPhone 7, which got distributed in Asia. So that was a happy moment, Yes, we didn't make any money, but somebody was actually using our design. And they actually took our design, had it certified by BSI, which is a pretty rigorous way of, getting certification for hardware in Germany. Bad news is they threw out the resilient function and replaced it with So that's one. And then the second overlap is, so Doug is not aware of this. This was around 2006-07, and back then I was into hardware and securing computer systems. Memory protection became a big issue because all these side channel people, they were measuring power consumption, injecting faults, and so on. And we said, okay, ideally we want to be able to, protect our memory from adversaries, flipping bits. Using glitches, row hammer, using software, etc. Many different ways to do that. So we need runtime protection. And we said, okay, well, we can use a standard approach, right? Using something like Merkle trees, maybe hashed, very simple application. This is basically what people in blockchain are doing, right? Take all the data you need to protect, build a big tree out of it, hash them together and hash the hashes and so on. The problem with this approach is, it's very slow because all these hashes need to be done in real time while you're accessing your memory, and that gets on the critical path, and it's horrible from a computer perspective, speed perspective. And at that time, I remember, so this is mid-2006. At that time, I remembered this paper. Do you, Doug? Many years, 96. And this is from my PhD years. I was doing PhD around from 95 through up until 2000. And Mustafa Atıcı, at that time, Doug's student, visited us at Oregon, gave a presentation around 97. And somehow this universal hashing stuck with me, and said, these schemes seemed very, simple and efficient to implement. And they're not cryptographic, they're statistical, but you can, with a proper cryptographic algorithm, you can actually get beautiful security out of this. So, and again, I'm skipping over the definitions, original definition by Carter and Wegman all the way back in 78. Basically, you have statistical guarantees on the distribution, output distribution. Okay, that's what universal hashing does. And if you take the universal hash function, randomly chosen with or parameterized with a key, apply it on your message. If you XOR it to a one-time path, could be also the output of something like AES, encrypted with a secret key, some seeds. Then you have, as long as this path is one-time path, you have unconditional security at the output. And this is a good way of protecting the integrity of a system. So there was a universal hash function definition by Black in '99. We took this and basically you have to define the function family. This is with integers modulo 2 to the w. At that time, Black defined this to be efficient on a regular software system, and he was trying to get it to run efficiently using Intel instructions and so on, and proved its universality or almost universality at the time. We said, okay, that's great, but we can do better. So we took that, we modified it, and we even implemented hardware, looked at the hardware, and we said, okay, this is a bottleneck. We removed that, reformulated it mathematically, and gave security, analyzed the statistical properties, and came up with 3 variations on the scheme, and implemented all the way in hardware, in an actual chip, including power consumption. This is the area and the delay. The first one is the original definition by Black, and this is what we have. So it's about 7 times faster. Requires about 30% of the original area, and the power consumption is also improved quite a bit. And we also took it to software then, remember real-time memory authentication, and implemented it. And here we're comparing not against NH, but against the SHA-based approach. This is the original SHA-based approach for checks, updates. You're doing memory references. Sometimes you're reading only, you're updating, and so on. And we are gaining quite a bit of speed up. And this is thanks to the universal hash function family that I was reminded of. So the third overlap, and I'm going to go quickly because I'm running out of time, is still a work in progress. I'm still working on this. This was about a month ago, and again, overlap with Doug's research. So since then, since this memory protection, so these are 2000 to 2010. After that, I moved away from hardware. I'm more at the software level now. I'm looking at side channel protection, especially microarchitecture attacks, and specifically I'm looking into post-quantum schemes, trying to both attack them and also come up with countermeasures to secure them against such attacks. And in the last 2 years, we have been able to attack successfully 2 post-quantum schemes that are or were both in the competition, in the NIST competition. One was LUOV, which got eliminated in round 3 in the NIST competition. It's a multivariate scheme. And then another one, which I just presented last week, actually, in Euro SMP, attacking dilithium, the dilithium signature scheme. So both the attacks are fault injection attacks. So we assume there is a fault injection mechanism. I'm going to show you what that is specifically. And then, you know, once we attack this, although it wasn't our intention, we said, why can't we use the same technique on ECDSA? Go back to traditional schemes that are already deployed and used, and see if they're vulnerable too, and, you know, enter ECDSA. And so how do we flip bits? So to flip bits, we're using something called row hammers. I don't know if you heard about this, but it's a software-only technique. So you can do this on any system, laptops, on the cloud servers, and so on. All you need is to be able to run your software alongside the victim's process. And shared cloud instances are a good example of that, as well as browser. You can even do through JavaScript if you want. Basically, what you're doing is you're targeting a victim row. So this is just a row in memory, and that you don't have access to. You're not allowed to, modify or read, but you don't care because you're not really targeting them directly, but you're targeting your own rows. And the key is to be able to locate memory spaces that are adjacent on top and below this row. And if you have, let's say, if you continuously write these kind of a pattern, 0, 0, zeros, you're likely to flip some of the bits in the middle and the target from 1 to a 0. And it also applies it backwards. If you keep writing once, you can also, you know, flip it back to some bits to 1. This has to do with the physical properties of the memories, the storage devices themselves. Not all bits are flippable. This is an example of an actual experiment where we kept hammering. This event of repeatedly writing is called hammering. Memory piece repeatedly. So the black locations are the ones that we're not able to flip. The white ones are the flip locations, and you see sometimes it takes a long time to get a lot of flips. And even now, even after 10 hours, we have locations that are not flippable. That's just those, you know, cells in the memory device are pretty solid and you can't. And of course, you wouldn't run an attack for 10, 16 hours, just maybe 1 hour or even less. That means you're only able to get some flips in locations that you cannot control. All right, so how does this apply on ECDSA? So this is a very simple description of, algorithmic description of ECDSA keygen and the signing operation. I'm not going to go through the details, but the part that matters is the signing part, this part here, where we generate the signature S, or part of the signature S, by computing K-inverse. This is the nonce inverted. This is the hash of the message, plus D, which is our target, the secret key, times R, the random nonce that we chose initially. Where is it? Okay, I can't see it. All right. Oh, yeah, it's the R coordinate of the K times Q. Thank you. And that has to do with the nonce K, right? It's a function of the key. So this is going to be our target. And so what we're going to do is, while the victim is signing, we're going to insert faults via row hammers. We're going to hammer the secret key, the place it's stored in memory. So D is, think about malloc. You're allocating some memory, right? When you're loading the key, you're loading into memory, you're computing your signature operation step by step, ECDSA signing. And while you're doing that, or after you have loaded, before you started signing, because there's a few cycles there, I'm going in and I'm not touching those locations, but I'm claiming the adjacent locations in memory, right? And I'm hammering them continuously. And by doing so, hopefully I will flip a bit. Now, if I flip a bit, S is going to be corrupted, become S bar. So anything barred here will be corrupted. And this is corrupted because now I have an additive factor delta on the original secret key, right? Hopefully, if I was successful, delta is not 0. It's actually some low weight thing. And in practice, you usually get like 1 bit, maybe 2 bits. So we're talking about a single bit flipped in these representations. Now, we do not know, the problem is we're able to inject the flip, but we don't know what K is, D is, right? That's the secret key, our target, and even the error vector. We don't know what it is. But we know that delta is bound. It has 1 bit of entropy, only 1 or maybe 2 of the bits got flipped. So the verification at this point will fail, right? So when we run the verification algorithm, all looks good, but we have all these complemented or barred variables, right? And R bar that we obtain is not going to match R anymore. And so we have an extra term coming from the deltas. Now, it so happens that we can actually algebraically quantify that. And so we basically get this nice equation here, R bar plus delta, so that's the noise term, right, times U2 bar times G is equal to R, the original R. So R bar is what we compute at the end of the verification, which we can also run. That's verification. Anybody can verify a signature, right? We have the public key. But we don't know what this is, right? And the original R we can actually obtain because we know the little r, right? That's part of the signature, and we can map it back to the point. There are only 2 cases, right, on the elliptic curve. So, and here it describes, it basically gives you a proof sketch, simple sketch. So if you trust me that this is correct, we can move to the next slide. And yeah, so now we can actually, our goal is to, from R bar to R, so we know this, we know this, we know G, we can compute U2 bar, and we can now try, right? It's an elliptic curve equality check, so we can't really compute delta directly, but there are only a finite number of possibilities. If, let's say, we have 256-bit ECC, try 256-bit locations, right? Or if you have 2 folds, it's only 256 square, or choose 2, right? It's still a small number. We can try them and see which delta actually matches this here. Now, once we have delta, okay, it's going to look something like this. Maybe if a fault occurred in the 5th bit, right, we get delta equals 32. This is how it's represented in binary. Now, if you look at this error pattern, this is an additive error, right, the way we expressed it, just because of the way ECC works. This means this bit value, right, got added with a 1 value. For a bit value, right, because we're flipping, we're only able to flip, it must have come from a 0 value. Right? If it was 1, it had no, either it would state 1 or go back to 0. But it's a positive delta, right? So the delta, if we take the magnitudes, here 32, take the log of it, it tells us the location. And the sign of delta tells us the direction, whether it went from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. So this is what we call the signature correction attack. And although we're only able to inject flips, we're using the verification, the signature verification as an oracle to figure out what the error pattern is. And from that, we're figuring out what the actual bit value in D is. So we know the 5th bit value now of D to be 0 because of this error pattern. Now, awesome. So by repeatedly running this, right, and generating every faulty signature will give us 1 bit or maybe 2 bits and of D. And so we obtain some scattered bits of D. The problem is we don't get all of the bits because remember we had non-flippable locations, right? Rowhammer is not that powerful. How do you recover the remaining bits? And so what we need is a DLP algorithm with partial knowledge. And this was like a month ago. I'm thinking, okay, so we have bits here and there, but so went back to the literature and remember that we can use Pollard's row or baby step, giant step. Now we have with this additional partial information. What do we do? Well, wanted to do good research, went online and started Googling, right? And if you hit the right words, this is what you end up with, right? So again, Doug. So this is all the way back in 2001. Came across a nice paper by Doug where he's looking at the baby step, giant step algorithm. He's building on earlier results by Odlichko and Coppersmith. and analyzing the situation a little bit more carefully, where he is looking at low weight keys in ECDSA. And so that's not the same as the problem I have, but maybe I can turn my problem into a form that this algorithm would work. Basically, I would have to extract the bits I recovered, and the remaining bits would represent a low weight representation for D. And again, this is still work in progress. In that case, this is my last slide. So in that paper, these are Doug's results. So the algorithm he gives has this kind of a complexity where M is the length of the number of bits, right, in D. So 256 maybe for ECDSA, maybe a little bit longer. P is the number of bits that are non-zero in the representation. So this would be the remaining bits, half of the remaining bits after I take out my bits, the ones that I recovered using row hammers. And this is the complexity. So this is very close to actually a full break. We're still working on it, and hopefully we'll get a full break done. So thank you. Thanks to everybody, and thank you, Doug, especially. And again, happy birthday.